The report arrived with no sender designation. That was the first thing vessel analyst Sorath Den noticed. Not its contents, not its timestamp, not the 17 classified headers stripped from its margins, just the absence. A document generated by a conclave monitoring station in the Kareth corridor, routed through 4 relay nodes, and somewhere in that chain, whoever filed it had removed their own name. Sorath Den had processed 11,000 military intelligence reports in her career. She had never seen one arrive unsigned. She opened it anyway. The first line read, "Human unit entered the designated war zone at 0340 station time. No communication, no formation, no support element, 1 vessel." She read it twice. Then she pulled up the sensor logs because she assumed, the way any rational analyst assumes, that something had been mistranslated. It hadn't. The Kareth corridor was not a place where things survived by choice. It was a graveyard dressed as a shipping lane, a narrow channel of navigable space between the Voth exclusion zone and the debris field left behind by the Third Consolidation War, where sensor ghosts from dead ships still occasionally pinged active military arrays and caused junior officers to file incident reports about vessels that had been destroyed 40 years prior. The Conclave had designated it a restricted war zone 18 months ago after the Harris Syndicate began using its sensor-blind pockets to stage ambushes on neutral freight convoys. 12 Conclave patrol vessels had entered the corridor in those 18 months. 4 had come back. The Harith Syndicate had 17 active warships positioned along the corridor's length, rotating in overlapping patrol cycles, with interdiction weapons calibrated specifically to the sensor profiles of Conclave military hulls. They had spent 3 years learning exactly how Conclave fleets moved, communicated, and responded to contact. The corridor was not a battleground. It was a mechanism. A designed system for the organized destruction of anyone who entered it. Sorath Den knew all of this. She had written 2 of the strategic assessments herself, which was why when she confirmed that the sensor logs showed exactly what the report claimed, 1 human vessel, no escort, no support formation, entering the corridor at the corridor's widest and therefore most heavily monitored entry point, she did not feel relief. She did not feel confusion. She felt something closer to grief. They didn't know, she said aloud to the empty operations room. She was wrong about that. She would understand that she was wrong about it for a long time before she understood why she was wrong. But that understanding would cost her something she hadn't agreed to spend. The human vessel was called the Ardent Persistence. It was a mid-tonnage multi-purpose hull. The kind of ship that human civilian registries categorized as a light freighter or, in certain configurations, a medium escort platform. It was not a warship by any definition the Conclave military classification system recognized. Its weapons load was light. Its shielding was rated for merchant operations. Its crew complement was listed in the Conclave's joint registry database as 11 personnel. Sorath Den pulled the crew manifest because she needed to understand, on some basic level, who was about to die. The commanding officer's name was Commander Voss. Age by human reckoning, 43. Prior postings, 7. Combat deployments, 4. The notation beside her name in the Conclave Liaison database, added by a Conclave diplomatic attaché 2 years earlier, read simply, difficult. That was it. No elaboration. Just the single word in the clean administrative font of an official record, as if the attaché had run out of language and settled for the most honest thing available. Sorath Den stared at that word for longer than was professionally appropriate. Then her communications panel lit up. Analyst. The voice belonged to Fleet Commander Oreth Vel, her superior and the senior Conclave military presence in this sector. His tone had the particular flatness of someone who had already decided how he felt about a situation and was calling to confirm that everyone else had decided the same way. You've seen the corridor report. I have. 1 vessel, yes. A pause. Not the pause of someone thinking. The pause of someone deciding whether to say the thing They were already thinking. The humans were briefed on the corridor situation 6 weeks ago. Full intelligence package. Harith positions, patrol rotations, interdiction signatures, survivor data from our lost patrols. Sorath Den felt something shift in the back of her mind. They were given everything we had. She looked back at the sensor log. The ardent persistence, cruising at moderate speed, no evasive pattern, straight down the middle of the entry channel, like a vessel that had not read the intelligence package or had read it and simply disagreed with its implications. Then why? She said, and stopped. That, said Orithvalve, is what I need you to find out. He ended the communication. The operations room was quiet again. Outside the station's viewport, the edge of the corridor was visible as a faint smear of navigational hazard markers, orange and amber, stretching across a band of stars. Somewhere inside that smear, 11 humans were flying directly towards 17 warships. Sorth Den began pulling every sensor feed she could access because she had the sudden, irrational, completely unprofessional conviction that she needed to watch this, not to file a report, not to build an analysis, to witness it. She didn't know yet what she was about to see, but some part of her, the part that had noticed the missing sender designation and felt the wrongness of it before her conscious mind caught up, already understood that whatever happened next was not going to be what she expected. She was right about that. She was wrong about almost everything else. The ardent persistence had been in the corridor for 40 minutes before the first Harith patrol vessel made contact. Sorath Den watched it happen through the Conclave's long-range monitoring array, grainy, time delayed by 11 seconds of signal travel, but clear enough. The Harith ship came out of a sensor shadow pocket in the debris field on the corridor's southern edge, running a standard intercept vector. It was a Harith cutter, fast and lightly armored, the kind of vessel designed to run down freighters and disable them for boarding. It broadcast a standard Harith interdiction signal, essentially a demand to cut engines and prepare for inspection that carried the unspoken but universally understood subtext of, or we will destroy you. The ardent persistence responded. Sorath Den leaned forward. The response was not a distress call. It was not a surrender signal. It was not an evasion maneuver. The ardent persistence broadcast on an open channel, the kind of frequency that every vessel in a 50,000-kilometer radius could receive, and the message was in 3 languages simultaneously: Harith trade dialect, Conclave standard, and human. She pulled the translation. Harith vessel, this is Commander Voss of the human ship Ardent Persistence. I know you can see my configuration. You know I'm not a threat to you alone. I'm telling you that anyway, so we're having an honest conversation. I have a cargo manifest, a route authorization, and a great deal of patience. What I don't have is any intention of stopping. So here's my offer: move, or watch what happens when you don't. Sorath Den read it twice, exactly as she had read the original report. The Harith cutter, according to the sensor log, held its intercept vector for 4 seconds after the transmission ended. Then it broadcast a response, not to the ardent persistence, but to its own fleet network, in encrypted Harith military code that the Conclave's array couldn't fully break in real time, though fragments parsed through. The fragments read, single hull, no formation, none nor. Confirm class. Unnormor, why is it not? The rest was noise. Then 3 more Harith vessels dropped out of their patrol positions and began converging on the Ardent Persistence location. Sorath Den watched the sensor plots redraw. 4 Harith warships, 1 human freighter. She opened a secondary display and pulled the Ardent Persistence power signature, a habit from years of reading ship state data. Power to weapons, minimal. Power to shields, standard merchant grade. Power to engines, moderate. The Ardent Persistence was not powering up for a fight. It was not running. It was maintaining its course at the same speed with the same engine output it had used when it entered the corridor, as if the 4 warships now closing on it were a minor navigational inconvenience rather than certain death. "What are you doing?" Sorath Den whispered. The operations room could not answer her. The sensor log could. Because at that moment, with 4 Harith vessels closing, weapons locks almost certainly acquired, the Ardent Persistence opened its cargo bay, not to jettison cargo in a panic, not to deploy any weapon system Sorath Den could identify. The cargo bay doors opened, and the Conclave long-range array registered a dispersal event, multiple small objects launched on a spread pattern, drifting outward from the human vessel in a rough sphere. The Harith ship slowed. Sorath Den stared at the dispersal pattern and tried to identify the objects. The array's resolution at this range wasn't sufficient for solid identification. They read as low mass, low power, irregular signature. Not weapons, not probes, at least not any probe format in the Conclave database. She flagged the dispersal event and kept watching, because the Harith ships had now slowed to a near stop, and nothing about that made any tactical sense. If the objects weren't weapons, there was no reason to stop. If they were weapons, there was no reason to stop. You'd be increasing your own vulnerability by holding position while a potential threat drifted toward you. But the Harith ships stopped anyway. And then, for 7 minutes and 22 seconds, nothing happened. 4 Harith warships and 1 human freighter, motionless in a dead stretch of the Karath corridor, surrounded by a slowly expanding sphere of unidentified objects, while the entire Harith fleet network, fragments still coming through the Conclave array, went briefly, completely, inexplicably silent. "Horeth," Vel called again at the 4-minute mark of the silence. He didn't say anything when the channel opened. He just breathed, and Sorath Den understood that he was watching the same feeds and had no better interpretation than she did. "The dispersal objects," she said. "I can't classify them. Neither can we." A pause. "My signals team says the Harith encrypted chatter went dark the moment the bay doors opened. Dark how? Not jammed, not overloaded, just stopped." As if every Harith operator on the fleet network decided simultaneously to stop transmitting. Sorath Den looked at the dispersal pattern on her display. The objects were still drifting, slow, tumbling, irregular. "They're afraid of them," she said. "Of what? Whatever those objects are, the Harith fleet thinks they know what they are, and it frightened them enough to stop the entire network." Another pause, longer this time. "We're working on identifying them. Our analysts think they might be they're wrong," said Sorath Den. She didn't know why she said it with such certainty. She corrected herself. "I mean, whatever they think they are, the Harith response doesn't fit any weapon profile. If it was a weapon, there'd be evasion, not silence." Orath Vel said nothing for a moment. Then, "Analyst, in all your years of intelligence work, have you ever seen a fleet go silent like this?" She thought about it seriously, because the question deserved a serious answer. "No," she said. He ended the call again. At minute 7, the Harith ships moved, not toward the Ardent Persistence. Away from it. A slow, deliberate withdrawal back toward their patrol positions, with the careful, measured pace of something that did not want to appear to be fleeing, but was, in fact, fleeing. The Ardent Persistence watched them go. Then, at minute 7, 22 seconds, Commander Voss opened the general channel again. "Thank you for the consideration. We'll be continuing our route now. Have a productive shift." That was it. The Ardent Persistence closed its cargo bay and resumed course. Steady speed, straight line. Sorath Den sat back and stared at the sensor display, and the question that had been building since she first read the unsigned report finally crystallized into a shape she could hold in her mind. What had been in the cargo bay? And the second question, the one that arrived immediately on the first heels like a shadow that had been there all along, why had Commander Voss known that opening it would work? The Conclave analysis team's best guess, delivered 3 hours later in a 17-page document that Surath Den read in 11 minutes, was that the dispersal objects were some form of psychological or sensory deterrent. The document used phrases like possible biochemical dispersant and unknown signal wave emitter and further analysis required in a frequency that told her the team didn't know either but had been pressured to produce something confident sounding. She filed the document and went back to the sensor feeds because the ardent persistence was still moving, still inside the corridor. In the Harith fleet, after its brief withdrawal, had resumed its patrol pattern, but with a difference that the analysis team hadn't mentioned, possibly because they hadn't noticed it. The patrol patterns had shifted. Every Harith vessel in the corridor had subtly, incrementally adjusted its route to maintain a greater distance from the ardent persistence current position. They weren't leaving, they weren't abandoning the corridor. But they were without any apparent coordination or communication, giving the human ship a wider berth. Surath Den mapped it. Then she mapped it again, because she wanted to be sure. 12 Harith warships, operating in overlapping patrol cycles, had organically, seemingly instinctively, opened a corridor of clear space around a single human freighter that, by any rational tactical measure, should have been destroyed and boarded within minutes of entering their zone of control. She pulled the ardent persistence sensor data again, looking for something she'd missed. And she found it, not in the weapons data, not in the power readings, but in the communications log. Before it entered the corridor, before any of this, Commander Voss had sent a message 14 hours before the ardent persistence crossed the entry threshold. The message wasn't to the Harith fleet. It wasn't to the Conclave. It was flagged in the log as a personal transmission, routed through a civilian relay. The recipient field was redacted. The content was redacted. But the timestamp existed and the duration of the transmission existed, 47 seconds. Long enough for a conversation, long enough for a name to be given, and a set of instructions to be delivered. Long enough potentially for whatever had frightened 17 Harith warships to be arranged in advance. Surath Den stared at the redaction fields and felt the ground shift under everything she'd concluded in the past 3 hours. She knew, Surath Den realized, before she entered, she knew they would stop, not hoped, not gambled. Knew, which meant the dispersal event wasn't improvised, it wasn't a bluff. And whatever was in that cargo bay wasn't a deterrent weapon or a biochemical agent or any of the 17 inadequate explanations the analysis team had generated. It was something the Harith fleet recognized. Something they feared so completely that 17 warships had collectively agreed without discussion to simply let a single freighter pass. What did humanity have in its cargo bay that could do that? Surath Den requested emergency access to the Conclave's full intelligence archive on human military engagements. She got it 6 hours later after Orath Bell signed off on the request with a note that simply said, "Find me something I can use." What she found was not what he meant by that. The human military record was, she searched for the professional term and couldn't locate one that fit, irregular. Not in the sense of being sparse or poorly documented, the opposite. Humanity had been a Conclave associate member for 9 years, and in that time, they had been involved in 14 documented military incidents of varying scale. Every one of them had been cataloged, analyzed, and assessed by Conclave intelligence teams. Every assessment said essentially the same thing. Humans fight in a manner inconsistent with expected rational actor models. Human force commitment does not scale proportionally to resource assessment. Human units demonstrate strategic behaviors that suggest either catastrophically poor threat calculation or deliberate, unexplained disregard for casualty forecasts. Recommend further study 14 incidents. 14 recommendations for further study. No synthesis document, no unified assessment, just 14 separate analysts reaching the same conclusion independently and apparently never speaking to each other about it. Sorath Den pulled the incident files and read them in chronological order. The third one stopped her cold. It was from 6 years ago. A human expeditionary unit had been stationed at a Conclave logistics depot in the Varath system when the depot was attacked by a Syndicate raider force, not Harith, a different Syndicate faction, with overwhelming numerical advantage. The Conclave garrison had retreated according to standard doctrine, rational. Correct by every tactical model in the database, the human unit had not retreated, 11 humans against approximately 200 Syndicate combatants. The engagement had lasted. Sorath Den checked the timestamp twice, 9 hours. At the end of 9 hours, the Syndicate force had withdrawn. The after-action report from the Syndicate faction, acquired through a Conclave intelligence asset and translated with a margin of error the analyst had helpfully quantified as substantial, described the engagement using a word that the translation system had flagged as uncertain. The word was rendered as either relentless or wrong, depending on the contextual parsing, and the Conclave analyst who'd processed the file had noted the ambiguity and then moved on without resolving it, which struck Sorath Den as the single greatest analytical failure in the entire document. Because both translations were probably accurate, and they weren't contradictory, she kept reading. Incident 5. A human officer had, during a ceasefire negotiation, voluntarily provided the opposing party with a complete and accurate account of human casualties and supply states, information that by any conventional diplomatic logic would have catastrophically weakened the human negotiating position. The opposing party had agreed to terms within an hour. The Conclave analyst who filed the assessment had labeled it inexplicable and moved on. Incident 9. A human unit had refused a direct order from a Conclave senior commander to abandon a position, not because they believed they could hold it, but because there were 12 non-combatants in the structure behind them. The unit had held the position. The Conclave commander had filed a formal complaint about human insubordination. The complaint was in the record, and below it, filed by a different hand, was a single added line. 12 non-combatants evacuated successfully. No comment. Incident 12 was a supply convoy escort that had somehow resulted in 2 Harith warships refusing to engage and filing a formal protest with their own command structure demanding to be rotated off the Kareth assignment. Sorath Den stopped on that one for a very long time. 2 Harith warships. A formal protest. About humans. 6 years ago, in the Conclave intelligence assessment of Incident 12 read, she found it, cross-referenced it, confirmed she was reading the right document, Harith evasion behavior attributed to possible sensor malfunction on Harith vessels. Human involvement assessed as coincidental. Stee set the file down, metaphorically. There was no physical file to set down, only a screen, and understood for the first time that the Conclave's intelligence apparatus had been systematically misinterpreting its own data for almost a decade. Not through malice, not through incompetence, through the simple catastrophic limitation of applying rational actor models to a species that did not operate on rational actor principles. The Harith fleet hadn't been afraid of what was in the cargo bay. They'd been afraid of the ship. Because they'd been in this situation before, or heard about it from someone who had, or received a report that their own intelligence apparatus had filed and then labeled coincidental, and then buried, and the information had propagated anyway through whatever informal network exists between soldiers who have faced something they can't explain. 11 humans on a freighter, and the Harith fleet gave way. Not because of the objects in the cargo bay. Sorath Den was now nearly certain those were something mundane. Something the Harith had pattern matched to a previous encounter and gotten wrong, misidentifying the ordinary as the ominous. The cargo bay opening was theater. The fear was already there. It had been building for 6 years. And the Conclave had labeled it coincidental 14 times. Fleet Commander. Sorath Den's voice was steady when she reached Orath Vel. though her hands, she noticed, were not. I need you to authorize an upgrade to this incident's classification level. On what grounds? On the grounds that this is not an incident. She pulled up her analysis screen. 9 hours of work condensed into a chain of cross-reference documents. This is a pattern. The Harith Syndicate's operational capacity in the Kareth corridor has been deteriorating for 3 years. Not from conclave pressure, from human contact events, most of which we classified as minor, unrelated, or coincidental. The ardent persistence didn't enter the corridor to demonstrate capability. It entered because Commander Voss already knew the corridor would open. A long pause. She knew. The Harith fleet's cohesion in this sector has been eroding. Incident by incident. Engagement by engagement. The humans have been, I'm not sure engaging is the right word. They've been existing in ways that the Harith find incomprehensible, and incomprehensibility in a military context reads as threat. You're saying they scared them. I'm saying they confused them, repeatedly, over years, and confusion. Sustained, escalating confusion about what an opponent is capable of and why they're doing what they're doing is more destabilizing than a weapon's advantage. Another pause. Longer. What was in the cargo bay, analyst? Soreth Den checked her latest cross-reference. The object dispersal pattern had finally resolved in the long-range array at higher resolution. The data had just come through from a closer relay node. Low mass, irregular signature, tumbling. She'd run the profile through the full conclave materials database. She found the match. Commemorative markers, she said. Silence. Excuse me, Orathvel said. They're a human cultural artifact. Small physical tokens. The specific type varies, but in this case they appear to be metal discs. Humans place them at locations of significance. Historical sites. Graves. She paused, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. Commander Voss scattered memorial markers for conclave personnel killed in the corridor, the 4 patrols that didn't come back. The silence stretched so long that Sorath Den checked the channel was still active. The Harith scanned them, Orathvel said finally, and thought, I don't know what they thought. She was honest about this. I know the Harith have a significant cultural relationship with the honoring of fallen combatants. It's in the intelligence profiles. They consider it a sacred obligation. When they scanned the objects and identified them as memorial markers, they would have understood on some level that the human vessel had entered their controlled zone to perform a ritual honoring of the dead. A pause. That wasn't a deterrent. That wasn't theater. Commander Voss entered a war zone to leave markers for people she never met, from a species that isn't her own. Why? The word was very quiet. Soreth Den thought about the word in the Conclave Liaison database. Difficult. Thought about the unsigned report. Thought about Incident 912, non-combatants evacuated, no comment, and Incident 5, the ceasefire where a human officer voluntarily revealed everything that would hurt her position, and somehow, inexplicably, won. Thought about 9 hours against 200 opponents for a logistics depot that, by any strategic calculation, wasn't worth 9 hours. I think, she said carefully, that Commander Voss believes they deserve to be remembered. That's it. That's the whole reason. Not strategy, not posturing. She thought they deserved it, and so she went. Orathvel said nothing. The Harith, Sorath Den continued, encountered a vessel that entered their controlled war zone, opened its bay in full view of 4 armed ships, scattered memorial markers for enemy dead, for conclave dead, not even humans, and then politely informed them it would be continuing its route. In the Harith. She stopped, reread the sensor log one more time to make sure she had the sequence right. The Harith paused, and then they moved. And then they got on their fleet network, which went silent because I think they didn't have a word for what they'd just seen, and then they gave way. A very long silence. What does that make them afraid of? Orathvel asked. Not what she'd do to them, Sorath Den said. What she wouldn't. She looked at the sensor feed, the ardent persistence still moving, halfway through the corridor now. No escort, no acceleration, just steady and straight and continuing. The Harith understands strength. They understand Stratton's. They understand strategy. They spent 3 years learning exactly how conclave forces move because we move in ways they can model. We do what the math says. We retreat when the odds say retreat. We commit when the odds say commit. She felt the realization settling into full weight. Commander Voss entered their war zone and did something the math doesn't say. The math says don't. The math says you'll die. She entered anyway, and not because she miscalculated. Because she decided the math wasn't the point. Another pause. Then Orath Vel said something Sorath Den had never heard him say in 6 years of working under his command. "I'm afraid," he said, very quietly. "I think I'm afraid of them. And I don't know if that's reasonable." Sorath Den watched the ardent persistence on the sensor feed. Steady, continuing. "I don't think reasonable is the measuring stick they use," she said. The ardent persistence exited the Karath corridor at 11:47 station time. No damage, full crew. The Harith fleet did not intercept it, did not fire on it, did not broadcast any signal on any channel. They simply let it through. Commander Voss filed a route completion report with the Conclave Logistics Office in standard format, noting no incidents, which Sorath Den read 3 times to confirm that the word "no incidents" was the actual assessment of a human who had walked 11 people through 17 warships and scattered memorial markers on the graves of strangers. She requested an interview with Commander Voss. The interview was granted 4 days later. Voss arrived in the Conclave Station's secondary conference room. She was shorter than Sorath Den expected, with the kind of face that looked like it had made a decision recently and hadn't revisited it, and sat down across the table and waited without apparent discomfort. "Commander," Sorath Den said, "I've spent 4 days trying to understand what you did in the corridor." Voss waited. "I think I have most of it." Sorath Den laid the analysis on the table between them. The incident files, the pattern, the deteriorating Harith cohesion, the 6 years of misinterpreted data. "What I don't have, what I cannot model, is this." She pointed to the cargo bay dispersal log. "You brought the markers before you knew you'd need them. Before you entered, which means you weren't using them as a tactic. You were going to leave them regardless." Voss looked at the log. "Yes," she said. "Why?" A pause. Not hesitation. Sorath Den recognized it as the pause of someone being precise. "Because they went in and didn't come back. Somebody should know we noticed. You didn't know them." "No." "They weren't human." "No." Sorath Den looked at her for a long moment. "Did you know the Harith would respond the way they did?" "I thought they might." A slight pause. "I've read the incident reports. The ones your analyst called coincidental." She said the last word without inflection, but Sorath Den felt it land. "The Harith have a word. I had a translator render it once. It means roughly, a warrior who fights past the point where victory matters. They use it as the highest honor they give to an enemy. They use it to describe opponents. They believe it's too costly to fight. Not because of the damage the opponent causes." She met Sorath Den's eyes. "Because of what it says about what the opponent is willing to absorb. And you believed they saw that in human forces. I believed they might consider 11 people entering their corridor in a freighter to lay markers for fallen enemies." She paused again. "As evidence that there's no rational upper limit to what we'll do for reasons they can't model." Sorath Den sat with that for a moment. "That frightens them." "Yes." "It should frighten us," Sorath Den said quietly, not meaning to say it aloud. Voss looked at her steadily. "Why?" "Because you're right. There's no rational upper limit." She gestured at the sensor logs, the incident files, 9 years of misclassified data. "We've been watching humans for 9 years and building models, and the models don't work because they assume limits." Every species we've encountered, including the Harith, has limits. There is a cost at which any species will stop, will rationalize stopping, will find a reason why stopping is the correct choice. She stopped. Voss waited. "What's your limit?" Sorath Den asked. She meant it as a serious question. "Not yours personally, your species." Commander Voss was quiet for a long time. Not evasive, thinking. The kind of thinking that happens when a question deserves a real answer. "I don't know," she said finally. "We haven't found it yet." Sorath Den's final report, the synthesis document that 14 previous analysts had somehow never produced, ran to 63 pages and was distributed to 18 senior conclave military and diplomatic offices within the week. Its conclusion was not a tactical recommendation. It was not a capability assessment. It was not a threat index score, though she included all of those. It was a single paragraph at the end of the document, flagged with the highest analytical confidence rating her office could assign. Human strategic behavior cannot be accurately modeled under any framework that treats acceptable loss as a finite and predictable variable. Human forces do not escalate to sacrifice. Sacrifice is the baseline from which they begin. Every engagement, every mission, every act observed in the 9-year record of conclave human contact has been, in some degree, an act performed at personal cost for reasons that cannot be reduced to strategic gain. This is not irrationality. It is a different rationality, one organized around values that persist past the point where continued action becomes survivable. The Harith Syndicate's loss of operational cohesion in the Karath corridor is not a military development. It is the predictable result of repeated exposure to a species that, by all evidence, does not calculate whether a thing is worth doing in the same terms as any other species in the conclave record. They calculate whether it is right, and they appear to have decided that the answer, more often than not, is yes. She submitted the report. She went back to her desk. She pulled up the long-range sensor feed one more time, habit, and found the ardent persistence in the system, docked at the freight station on the corridor's far side, cargo offloaded, crew presumably in whatever state humans entered after doing what these 11 had done. She looked at the vessel's ID marker on the display for a long time. Then she looked at the 11 names on the crew manifest. She didn't know them. They weren't her species. She opened a file. She was not sure what she was doing until she was already doing it. She typed their names, all 11, and below each name she typed what they had done, specifically, completely, with no abbreviations and no analytical jargon. It took a while. When she was finished, she saved the file. She didn't know what category to put it in. It wasn't an intelligence document, wasn't a report, wasn't any format her system recognized. She filed it under personal. Outside her viewport, the Karath corridor was quiet for the first time in 18 months. The Harith fleet was still there, still moving, still patrolling. But they had moved. And the mathematics of it, the geometry of 17 warships giving way to one freighter, was now permanently in the record. It would be cited in future assessments. It would become an incident. It would be studied. Eventually, someone would understand it the way Sorath Den had come to understand it. Not as a capability demonstration, not as a tactical victory, not as proof of any advantage that could be quantified and countered and planned around, but as evidence of something that could not be planned around, because you cannot build a wall against an opponent who is not calculating whether the wall is worth climbing. You cannot calibrate a threat response for a species that treats "should we stop" as a question they already answered long before the shooting started, long before the war zone was mapped, long before the odds were calculated, answered not with probability or with strategy, but with something older and quieter and to every other species in the known galaxy, almost incomprehensible. The Harith had a word for it. A warrior who fights past the point where victory matters, Every other species in the conclave would, in time, learn their own word for it. They would not choose the word. It would be assigned to them, slowly by experience, the way all true understanding arrives, not in the moment of revelation, but in the quiet afterward, when you sit with what you witnessed and realize that the question you started with, "What did they do?" was always the wrong question. The right question was simpler. The right question was, when did they decide? And the answer that haunted Sorath Den's file and Orath Velv's silence and 17 Harith warships drifting in formation around an empty corridor was that humans had decided long before you ever saw them, long before they entered your war zone, long before they scattered their markers across your battlefield, long before you had the chance to decide whether they were a threat worth measuring. They had already decided, and they were already on their way.